All right, how are you all doing? Can you hear me okay? Thumbs up? Good. I'm in Quebec. I'm in Montreal, so I just want to make sure my connection is as good as it is in Vancouver. Sometimes I have problems with Bell here, but we're good. We're going to jump right into it because we've got a lot to cover tonight. So I am going to talk about the topic is power policy and sustainable development. The ebb and flow of environmental assessment over time. And I chose that for a specific reason because I think sometimes we don't really realize just how much influence the government has or governments have over environmental decisions. We sometimes think that there's this kind of disconnect between what we do and who we choose when we vote, and then what actually happens when it comes to environmental issues. And that's in general, but specific to environmental impact assessment, I think it's quite interesting to look at that as an example because it's a very, very, very clear example of how policy evolves into legislation, which then has a very direct impact on the decisions that are made, which affect us. And there's also a very clear connection, demonstrable connection between what people are thinking in society and kind of the social response to issues and what happens in regard to environmental assessment legislation. Okay, so that's why, and so some of you are taking the course in Zero and environmental management tools where we're looking at EIA, whereas others are looking at sustainable development, but it both applies. And in fact, it probably is going to be just as, if not more interesting for those in sustainable development because, we've talked about broad general things and we haven't really, I mean, this is EIA specific. It's a very, very specific thing. So there we go. So first question is, what is this topic all about? So why did I think of doing this right now particularly? And what does it mean to just decisions that are made in general? Well, the thing is, if there's one thing we need that's probably been made crystal clear over the past 6 months, it's that we don't live in a static world, right? Correct? Like the world we're experiencing right now is fundamentally different than the world we were experiencing before mid-March. And so therefore, I mean, we see that there is a social dynamic and this dynamic between how we respond to the world and then how we how those responses get manifested in policies that affect us, right? And pandemic's a really good example, but I'm going to talk about environmental impact assessment. So policy and social norms are always in flux. Although they say law is law, laws change and laws get amended, laws get new acts are written and so forth. And a lot of that has to do with the change in social norms. So we respond to what's happening in the world. I mean, that's what happens with policies. What is of a concern to people will ultimately result in some way, shape, or form in a policy response. And if there's a strong enough response, a strong enough concern, then these kind of uprisings or wide-scale social concerns can get translated into policy, and that policy can become legislation. And then legislation leads into actions on the ground, very concrete actions on the ground, enforced actions on the ground. So what I want to talk about then is this idea of environmental impact assessment, EIA, and then how it links with this kind of the idea of power and then policy and then what this means for sustainable development. That's really what we're going to talk about. So first off is, what is EIA? So what is it? Who thinks that EIA is about sustainability? Anybody think that? Do you think an environmental impact assessment is about greening the world? Yes or no? No, says Sarah. Sarah's probably done EAAs. Speaking from experience. Erica, no. Anybody else? I would say necessarily. Helps us to assess sustainability, for sure. I would say my gut reaction is no, based on my experience. However, I will caveat that and I will say not necessarily, because there are situations in which environmental impact assessments have been done and they've been resulted in projects that otherwise would have been done but were detrimental to the environment were not done. And they were done because the EIA review panel came out and said, look, this is not a good idea. So I would say not necessarily, not all the time, but not necessarily. So these are some definitions from EIA, a few of them. The process of identifying, predicting, evaluating, and mitigating the biophysical, social, and other relevant effects of a development proposal prior to major decisions being made, taken, and commitments made. Another one is EIA evaluates all relevant environmental and resulting social effects which would result from a project. Third one is EIA is a tool for identifying and predicting the impacts of projects and investigating and proposing means of their management. And lastly, EIA is a process to predict the environmental effects of proposed initiatives before they are carried out. Okay, so the key there is EIAs are for projects or proposed developments. Usually they're big infrastructure projects like a dam or a highway or whatever. And you go through a process of assessing the potential biophysical, social, and other relevant effects, and then propose ways to mitigate them, accentuate the positive effects, and then mitigate the negative effects. In reality, out of all those definitions, it's a mix. Fundamentally, it's a process for helping decision-making aimed at addressing concerns about potential environmental impacts of proposed actions. So this is a forward-thinking activity. It's for things that haven't occurred yet, and then you're proposing to do them, and we assess whether or not they should go ahead, or if they do go ahead, some things that we can do to minimize the environmental effects. So an environmental assessment is not really always about doing the green thing. It can be, but not always. The bottom line is it's a process. But, and what's relevant to this discussion tonight, it has its roots in revolution. That's where EIA came from social revolt. So where did it come from? So what year do you think EIA really started to kind of materialize in North America? That's what we're looking at here. Anybody? Alicia's close. Why do I want to say 1967? Because that's really darn close. That's it. I was looking for an era, so you're right. It's the 1960s, okay? So for those of you, I mean, I don't know if anybody was alive at that point in time, but that I wasn't, and it was an era of, I'm sure everybody's heard about the 60s and the 70s. It was an era of what? What was happening in the 60s and 70s? Social upheaval, absolutely. Civil rights, for sure. Women's rights, right? Basically an opening up of society, a beginning of the environmental movement, right? It really started in that era. That's when the environmental movement, as we know it today, I would say it had started previous to that. If you study people like John Muir or you know, Al Leopold, I mean, it's not like there wasn't an environmental movement before, but the modern environmental movement as we know it today started in the 60s, okay? And really there was a book by a woman named Rachel Carson called Silent Spring, absolutely, Julio, that was the catalyst for this. That book, if you haven't read that book, I would recommend picking it up. It should be on your library if you work in the environmental field. Was a catalyst for people to be concerned about specific things in the environment. Namely, what? What was the main thing that really rose to people's attention? Right, pesticides. It was about the presence of pesticides in the environment, in water and food, that was documented in that book, that was then popularized. So in French, you'd say vulgarize, which it's making science kind of palatable or accessible to the public. And that book is a really good example of environmental vulgarization. So that book really made everybody kind of freak out, actually, and become environmentalists because they saw it as a threat to their health. And so as a result of that, this widespread social upheaval in the United States, but then also in Canada, resulted in something called the US NEPA, NEPA, which is the National Environmental Policy Act, was introduced in 1969, and it was passed as legislation in 1970. Okay, and that act was the first form of official legislated environmental assessment law in North America. Canada followed shortly thereafter in about 1973 with the national EIA system and an act as well. And the key thing that NEPA brought out was that every development project that was to occur, every new development project had to identify and address and identify potential environmental impacts with an environmental impact assessment statement. Okay, so they call that an EIS, which is not dissimilar to what we have today. So in the 70s, this is where it started to be implemented. The purpose of an EIS was to identify the effects on the environment, impacts, and actions to manage or monitor those impacts. It came across at the national level, but they were state level processes emerged as well in the United States. And the only thing that was remotely close to that before this was something called a CBA, a cost benefit analysis, right? So there were project analyses that had been done before, but there wasn't really any kind of, at least even superficial, environmental assessment that went along with the cost benefit analysis. That was typically about whether or not it was economically beneficial to do the project. So a standard CBA does not really address externalities such as the immediate or long-term environmental damage that might result from a project. Okay, so that was really what happened, okay? And that legislation that got put into place both in Canada and the United States would not have happened were it not for the social response and the social upheaval. And I want you to kind of make a note of that because it's really important to see what happened when people got, you know, upset or concerned enough about an issue that it changed the way things happened, right? So in the 1980s, EIA through NEPA was actually criticized pretty significantly because most people concerned or considered that as strictly a permit to develop. So there was many projects that were initiated that didn't even have a complete environmental impact assessment done, right? So before the actual assessment was done, the ground was being broken and the project was being pushed forward. So, I mean, clearly people were a little concerned about that it was just basically a rubber stamp type of process. But as things developed, the scope for an EIA broadened and more refined techniques were established as a result. So in the 1980s, that was very much a scientifically and technically driven era. So one thing that happened was there was far more detailed technical and scientific methods were implemented with EIAs. Large inventories of environmental factors for projects were considered. So you get these kind of technocratized, these, how do you say, technifying, I guess, EIAs to the point at which they became so massive and so big with these huge inventories. It's like looking at a GRI report or CSR report with all these indicators in it, and you just kind of blur, right? You lose sight of it. And so what happened as a result of that is this need for scoping emerged. So the need for scoping emerged to identify specific priorities. So priorities for different things that are the most important factors in an EIA. So from scoping, and a lot of what happened with scoping was based on public input. They would try to determine what the most significant factors were for a given project, and that was done through public consultation. So in the 1980s, the scoping of EIs really gave birth to this public consultation and public review process. So these reports, which initially were quite onerous, I mean, they were huge, started to become a little more accessible, and that has been a big problem with EIA, even up until today. The reports were really inaccessible, very technical and very scientific, and although EIA at that point in time was raised as a concern about people's concern about toxins, these reports that were produced were raised like indecipherable for most people. So this public input resulted in a bit more emphasis on social impacts as well as the biophysical effects, and also scale dependence emerged as an issue. So regional effects were starting to be considered more than just the local effects of a project itself. So into the 1980s and 1990s, we had a much greater concern for international environmental issues. So what would be some examples in the 1980s and 1990s of things that really became concern to the general public from an international standpoint? What would be a couple examples of those? Exactly. The ozone hole is one. What's another one? Those in sustainable development should have an idea too. Ozone hole and think of the Great Lakes. Blooms, but the one that really hit the issue in eutrophication, Lake Erie, acidification. You got acidification, acid rain. So acid rain was a huge issue in the 80s and into the 90s, as was ozone depletion. Climate change, not so much, frankly, not really, wasn't really quite there yet. And then the whole idea of sustainable development. I mean, that emerged as well in that, actually before that, but really started to become more of an issue. So in 1992 and 97, we had the Earth Summits, 92 particularly, and that is when we had kind of the idea of sustainable development, the Climate Convention, Biodiversity Convention, Land Degradation Convention materialized. So these were large movements in the policy sphere internationally. And they fostered an increasing role for EIA because it became much more visible, much more important internationally, as well as in the policy realm. Because when a convention comes into effect, governments sign on to it. When a government signs on to a convention, they have to then kind of toe the line with respect to what is laid out in those conventions. So this whole definition of environment evolved based on this kind of exposure, became far more social, demographic, cultural, and economic than just a purely scientific or technical review for projects. So previously very traditional methods for EIAs became much more broad by looking at qualitative input and so forth and so on. So in the 90s, how would you characterize the 90s? What was something really that kind of came on in the 90s big time that was influencing pretty much everything that we do today? At the start of the 90s, we didn't really have it. By the end of the 90s, it was controlling everything. Not climate change, internet, there we go. Well, technology in general, actually, I'd say. Information technology. I remember at the start of the 90s, yes, we had computers and everything, but it wasn't like it was at the end of the 90s, where that was just the dominant force in moving things forward in business and society. And with that, so in the 1990s, more of a systems perspective was brought to environmental impact assessment. People were thinking in systems, right? Because We did information systems, database management systems, communication systems. So problems became more interconnected. They became more considered more multi-scale, both in time and space, and they involved both quantitative and qualitative approaches. So and early action was becoming more prevalent in light of instances where irreversible situations were experienced. So we had learned actually at that point in time in the 90s about how some situations had become almost irreversible. Some not, like ozone depletion, we managed to reverse that, same with acid rain. But in terms of, say, depletion of resources, cod, for instance, we had seen that we had depleted and damaged some parts of the environment to the point at which they weren't going to recover very quickly. And this is the good example of the resilience theory from the Atlantic cod fisheries. So there was much greater emphasis at that point in time on forecasting what might go wrong and early action, and being like the precautionary principle is what we talk a lot about in the environmental industry. That became a more of a priority and thought about more often. So social effects, cultural effects, health impacts, adaptive environmental management became more commonplace in EIA. So you can see how this kind of interplay between what's going on in society influences how environmental impact assessments are carried out. So into the 2000s, we started to see EIA as a critical tool in environmental management. We started to see sustainability assessments are becoming more of the norm, and sustainability assessment looking at like an ongoing assessment of sustainability as opposed to an EIA, which is a one-off process for a project. So this connection between EIAs and then environmental management or sustainability assessments. Integrating cumulative effects, public empowerment, embracing uncertainty, fostering adaptive approaches, and championing sustainability really became the norms into the 2000s. Earlier on, kind of, but certainly more and more. And today, as I'll get to, they are just the way things are occurring. So there was a need for better definitions concerning the broad scope sustainability assessments. Things actually got too broad. And there was also a concern that such broad perspectives may actually dilute the previously strong rational EIA. And in fact, that's a concern today, is that if we're getting so broad and so interdisciplinary, that what about the actual, original scientific and technical assessment of a project? So technology and communication play a much, much larger role in EIA today into the 2000s than they did before. Monitoring and ongoing assessment are very critical now, and they're going to be even more so into the future. So we see this transition where technology has an influence, politics have an influence, but also just social norms in general have a pretty strong influence on how EIAs have been carried out. Now, if we look at the political side of things, we can see a very, very interesting pattern in Canada, and this is what I want to shift to. Because it's where most of us are. So Canadian politics into the 2000s, we had environmental impact assessment legislation, but there's always this push and a pull between what they describe as efficiency versus efficacy in environmental assessments, right? So what do you think happens when there's this push towards efficiency in environmental assessments? What do you think the result is of that? Inevitably, because that's just the way history shows us this. If everybody's paying, particularly the government, to make environmental assessments more efficient, yes, push develops through faster. And so what happens often? Yes, potential impacts get missed. Things get skipped over, and in fact, there are higher barriers, meaning the triggers for EIAs become less stringent. So therefore, things are passed more easily. In fact, a lot of things aren't even subject to an EIA as a result of the push towards efficiency. Now, efficacy is the other side of the coin, where we want to see that an environmental impact assessment is more effective. That typically involves a greater degree of rigor in certain steps, and often more steps. And you can understand who sits on what camp. I mean, those that are wanting to see projects develop, they want to see things happen efficiently, right? Because it takes time, and time is money. And those that want to see things done thoroughly and often don't want to see development occur, want to see the more effective environmental impact assessment. So this is this kind of dichotomy that exists in this trade. So in the 2000s, this push and pull between efficiency and efficacy was pushed in the efficiency direction, right? So, and this was during the time of Stephen Harper when he was the prime minister. And so this was manifested, like literally, you can see this in the legislation. So in 2012, the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act was rewritten and published as the CEAA 2012. And in that act, measures were implemented to reduce the time EIAs were done, the time required, and to eliminate some of the steps with the view to streamline the process. They actually changed it quite a bit than what it was previously, and to great effect. There was quite a bit of uproar over that. But they were able to do that at that point in time because, of course, they were the government in power. So there was a particular interest at that point in time on the part of energy companies to have this happen. So things like, pipelines and so forth could get done in a more efficient way. So, however, what happened in 2015 in Canada? Yes. In 2015, we had a new federal government come into power. I mean, this is this ebb and flow of concern and public response. And so if you recall, what they ran on was a decidedly different platform across the board from what had previously been in place, right? So the main priority of the previous government was stable, strong economic hand in place and keep the status quo, keep deficits and debt as low as they could be. Whereas this new platform that was put forth by Trudeau and the Liberal gang was to be far more progressive with the environment and to address some of those concerns, particularly First Nations issues. Climate change was another issue that was put on the priority. And one of the first things that they did when they got in power, which was kind of interesting, was they put in place a kind of like the A team of environmental assessment. And this is what they did. So they put in place a group of people, appointed a group of people who were to serve as a review panel for environmental assessments. And that's the terms of reference for what they were supposed to do, which was pretty good, actually. They were to go out and survey and review and study environmental impact assessment to determine what needs to happen. And so they went and did that. And the people that they appointed to do that were actually very, very good folks. Johanne Jelena was the chair, who's she's a really well-known environmental professional. She was the former Auditor General for Sustainable Development for Canada. So like the Auditor General for Canada, but focused on sustainable development. We have a person that does that for the government. She was that before this role. And then a few other people that are in their own rights very kind of esteemed. So what they did was they spent, I think, at least a year, maybe a year and a half, studying and talking to people, doing review panels and so forth. And they produced this report here, which I'll send through, which basically outlined what they felt needed to happen with environmental assessment going forward. And that would then turn out to be somewhat of the blueprint for the environmental assessment revisions that occurred. Perhaps not as extreme as what they had hoped, because they, I don't think they were completely happy with, some of the things that happened as a result. But the report that they did is quite thorough. So there's three main areas that they said there's suggestions that they need to act on. First, Indigenous considerations. This is a big thing, and certainly with the Trudeau Liberals, reconciliation was a number one was one of the highest priorities for that government, as was environment, and then social spending on infrastructure, without so that we could have future benefits from the investments that we needed to make. So these are the considerations that they came up. So Indigenous people should be included in decision making at all stages of impact assessment in accordance with our own laws and customs. Processes require the assessment of impacts or to asserted or established Aboriginal or treaty rights and interest across all components of sustainability. Any impact authority be designated an agent of the Crown and through a collaborative process, thus be accountable for the duty to consult and accommodate the conduct of consultation and the adequacy of consultation. So this was to be done under a collaborative framework developed in partnership with the impacted Indigenous groups. So there was a partnership framework that needed to be done. Any impact assessment authority increase its capacity to meaningfully engage with and respect Indigenous peoples by improving knowledge of Indigenous peoples and their rights, history, and culture. So meaning know more about Indigenous practices. A funding program be developed to provide long-term ongoing impact assessment capacity development that is responsive to the special needs and contexts of diverse Indigenous groups. Specific funding for programs be enhanced to provide adequate support through the whole IA process in a manner that is responsive to the specific needs and context of Indigenous groups. Legislation require that Indigenous knowledge be integrated into all phases of the impact assessment in collaboration with and the permission of and oversight of Indigenous groups. So that was pretty new, like incorporating Indigenous knowledge. There had been previous to this a mandate to involve Indigenous peoples, but not to this degree, I found. And impact assessment legislation confirmed Indigenous ownership of Indigenous knowledge and include provisions to protect Indigenous knowledge from and against its unauthorized use, disclosure, release. Again, a really important issue to protect Indigenous knowledge. The other aspect of this was public participation. So one of the main recommendations they had was to, the legislation will require that impact assessments provide early and ongoing public participation opportunities that are open to all. Results of the public participation should have the potential to impact decisions. So it's not just boilerplate tokenism. Participant funding program to be commensurate with the costs associated with meaningful participation in all phases, including monitoring and follow-up. And then lastly, impact assessment legislation require that impact assessment information be easily accessible and permanently available and publicly available. And that's not new either. And the last aspect of things that they wanted to see, they recommended happen were that evidence-based impact assessment be put at the forefront. So that impact assessment legislation required that all phases use and integrated the best available scientific information and development of a central consolidated and publicly available federal government database housing all the data. The impact authority with power to compel expertise from federal scientists and to retain external scientists, so get the best scientists possible. The authority to have the statutory authority to verify the scientific accuracy of studies across all pillars of sustainability, integrate the best evidence from science, Indigenous knowledge, and community knowledge through a framework determined in collaboration with Indigenous groups, knowledge holders, and scientists. Again, that is new, that's unique. There's one thing to consult, there's other thing to really kind of establish a framework through which knowledge will be used. And then the authority to lead the development of the impact assessment statement, and the impact assessment decisions reference the key supporting evidence they rely on, including the criteria and trade-offs used to achieve sustainability outcomes. So if you look at all of these principles, which I will push through, but they're available in my notes, so you'll have those if you want them here. I'll just put it through here. Those are the main principles that they found. There's a lot there, but you'll see those in the notes when you download them. So when you read that, you think, oh my gosh, wow, this is going to change the world. This is, wonderful. So now, did that happen? Well, it's hard to say. I mean, this is what happened as a result of this. So that was in 2017, I think that report was published. Correct me if I'm wrong. And then it took some time and took some, because legislation takes time to be formulated and so forth. But as a result of that, the whole kind of process of impact assessment was changed. And in fact, they created the Impact Assessment Agency here. When you go to this website, you'll see. And then ultimately, they created a new act. So the Impact Assessment Act of 2019, which you can see here. Okay, which outlines actually, when you dig into it and you go to those websites, you can see that let's go to one of those websites, go to the second one I put through. So the process one, if you look at the process, one thing is they've done, which I think great, is they've made it a lot easier to understand this. Even if you go to the impact assessment process overview, this is a lot more clear than the previous process that they had laid out. Even the website's cleaner and it's easier to understand. And you can go through this, and I would recommend you do go through this. In each one of those phases, you can see who are the main stakeholders and the roles of the responsibility of the proponent, the agency, the public, Indigenous groups, other jurisdictions like provincial or territorial, and the federal authorities. And then you can see a step-by-step process that they go through and what needs to happen at each one of those steps, right? Which is pretty good. And so if you look at this planning stage and you go by the step-by-step, so here, if you go to this website and look at planning, one of the things that you always want to see, well, a report was done and did anything happen as a result of that? And if you look at this, you'll see that down at the step 15 of the phase 1, you have, if an impact assessment is required, the agency continues to engage with Indigenous groups, the public, other jurisdictions, including Indigenous jurisdictions, and federal expert departments in order to develop the 1, public participation plan, 2, the Indigenous engagement and partnership plan, 3, the impact assessment cooperation plan, 3, the permitting plan, and thirdly, or lastly, the tailored impact statement guidelines, which includes the scope of the factors. So this thing here, this Indigenous engagement partnership plan, is exactly what they had laid out in that review panel report. Was they wanted to have a framework that was co-developed that outlined how there was to be engagement or participation by Indigenous people, how knowledge was going to be shared, how was it managed, and presumably that's supposed to be handled in this. I mean, this is a guideline, so you have to look at an EIA to see whether or not that happened, but it's there, right? Which is actually quite admirable. So that is what happened. And all of this came about because there was a change in government. That would not have happened had the same government stayed in power. It would not have changed. I can pretty much guarantee that. So the question now is that I have for you is, so what gives? Is it better? Is environmental impact assessment better now than it was 30 years ago, 20 years ago, or even 5 years ago? So 30 years ago, I'd say yes, it most certainly is, because we're more sophisticated with the science. We've got a broader scope to things. We're incorporating traditional knowledge that didn't happen in the 1970s. Now, specifically though, are we better now than we were 5 years ago when we had the 2012 legislation in place in Canada? I would say I don't know. The jury is still out, in my opinion. We can debate that. I think what I would like to see in order to make an assessment of that is to see more projects that have been completed. And considering the legislation's only been enacted in 2019, it's hard to say, because we haven't seen a lot of EAAs done under this new legislation yet. So I would say we need some more projects completed. The optics are fantastic on this. Like, the optics look good. We did a report, we have new legislation, but as we know, the government that we currently have is quite good at optics. So the proof is in the pudding, as they say. And the pudding in this case will be in looking at projects that have been done and reviewed and seeing whether or not they have done a good job. So what about internationally? That's Canada. And I'm going to end with the international scene. So what is influencing this process internationally? Because it's different. We don't have national legislation. We have international kind of regulations in some cases, but we're dealing with nation states that may not have EIA legislation. So a lot is influencing it. In fact, there is too much to cover in this session tonight for me to go into it. I'm going to go into it next week. That's what next week is going to be about is international environmental assessment. But there are some elements that I'd like to conclude with and take note of on this theme of power, policy, and sustainable development. One, international financial institutions. So those are things like particularly development banks, the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, the Asian Development Bank. I will talk about those next week. Investors, NGOs, and civil society are all moving projects and development towards forwards in the direction of sustainability. Not all financial institutions, but most of the development-oriented ones certainly are, and a lot of the NGOs concerned in this space are, and civil society as a whole, I would say, is. They each have power, but they exercise it in a different way. And I'm going to go into that next week to say, like, this is how these groups exercise their power and what happens as a result of that in this international EIA context. So, to conclude, where might this all go? Well, the bottom line here is we have to pay attention to how federal and provincial officials craft policy. This is the one thing that I really would like to leave you with, is pay attention to how they are developing, crafting, implementing policy, and how that results in legislation and law. Do not let this slip by. Like, do not think it's not important, because I hope that you've seen over this brief explanation of the historical development of EIA in Canada that it actually has a very, very significant impact on what happens on the ground. So we really need to pay attention to it. We also have to pay attention to how policy is acted on, right? It's not enough to do a report. As we've seen, there's been reports that have been done. We need to see how these reports are put into action via the project reviews and strategic reviews. This is why I say, in my opinion, the jury is still out on the Canadian Environmental Assessment or the Impact Assessment Act of 2019. We just simply haven't seen enough evidence to analyze whether it's good, bad, or what the outcome has been. So it's really our responsibility as citizens, it's us, it's society, that forced governments to create EIAs in the first place. It's society that did it, right, through our social uprising in the 1960s and 70s. Therefore, it can be us, citizens, to have them really act on and improve these policies and legislations or laws, especially considering the new norms that we are currently faced with. So the new norms that we are now faced with today are pretty significant. We have actually a dramatic social upheaval happening, which we will have to pay a close attention to see how that is going to then permeate into policies and legislation that will affect not just the environment, but society in general, but in our case, when we look at the environment. So for instance, what are some things that you think that are part of this social upheaval today that we can expect to see manifested in policies? What are some things that are happening that you think probably should start to kind of be brought into the policy fold? What do you think? What's one big issue we're faced with? Alberta's going to ask equality for funding of social programs. Good. Sarah, Alberta's going the opposite way of what I think should happen by using the pandemic as used to lower environment. Yes, I saw that in the news today. So again, right? But it's power. They're using their power in a way that, you know, one could argue is not really speaking to sustainable development, right? So we need to pay attention to that. We should not let these things slide. Why would Ottawa sign an agreement with Alberta to lower monitoring? Did Ottawa sign the agreement, or is it just strictly provincial? I don't know enough about that. I have to look into that. Okay. interesting. Okay, just let me a sec. Well, I think one thing, this is where we need to dig into it. My assumption is that as a result of the pandemic and the economic impact of it, Alberta is saying to Ottawa, we need as little restrictions as possible to mobilize industries so that our workers can get back to work, to increase development and capacity increase. That's it. To try and jumpstart the economy, which I can understand, but perhaps there's other ways to do that, right? I'm not sure that standards is the quick way to do that, but that goes counter to the federal government, definitely, for sure, 100%. This is why I say words and reports are cheap. Actions are what we need to pay attention to. Right? It's easy to say things. It's harder to do things. So one of the responses, if I were to look at that situation, I'd say, fine, we need to restart the economy. Reverting to the lowest common denominator would be the easiest thing to do, but are there not ways that we can get people working and making money and still maintain some of those environmental standards, maybe get people working on some different forms of tech, retraining, so forth. I mean, I just think we have to think in those ways now. I mean, especially if you're coming out strong on that platform, on that front. And I'm not an enemy to the energy sector, trust me. I've worked in oil and gas and downstream and upstream, so I have a lot of clients and colleagues in Alberta. I'm not at all opposed to it, but the reality is the world is changing. We're moving into a carbon-constrained economy. We need to address that in a very big way. So that is a good example. So equality for funding of social programs, that's an issue, right? That will be something we need to look at. What about gender? There's not a lot of emphasis on the EIA. I think that will be a big issue that is going to come through in policy. It started to, and we'll see more of it. It's actually in the international policy, which we'll cover next week, you see much more of that. Very, very clear gender policy. In fact, often it makes it's crystal clear. It makes a lot of sense. Actually, perhaps I don't want to say more sense, but in some cases where you're dealing with some of the countries that there is really very little rights for, there's massive gender inequality in some of these countries, and there needs to be a leveling of that ground immediately. So that's one issue that I think we'll see come up, gender. I think also with the equality, I think we may even see, we're going to see racial, Indigenous as well as Black racial issues brought more prominently into policies, environmental as well, so, and in education as well. So those are the things to pay attention to. The last component that is the one that I think is the most obvious right now is safety, right? Health and safety. So our environmental assessment legislation might be significantly impacted by this pandemic. And I think it's just something I've literally, I'll send this through. I just sent in a proposal for this. Here's something that is actually, this will be next week. I'll talk about this stuff. I just put this through. And this is trying to restart the Caribbean economy in a sustainable way. Give us your ideas. So my team and I put together something for this. I don't know if we'll get it or not, but why? Because the pandemic has basically turned off 50% of the GDP of most of the countries in the Caribbean. It would be like half of the GDP of Canada just got eliminated for this year. None, zero, no flights coming in. And they are desperate to find a way to reopen and at the same time foster some of the principles associated with sustainable development, such as food security, climate change mitigation, adaptation, and so forth and so on, and a gender component to it. Those are the things now. I am seeing it now, and we will see more of it. And this is an example of it through the IDB. So there we go. I mean, this is how, when society changes, environmental assessment will change. How fast and how, it's hard to say. But in our role, just as citizens to start with, but then also more, I guess, more actively as professionals, we are the ones that work in this field. We are the ones that are, in some cases, writing the policy. We're certainly the ones that are going to be impacted by it professionally. We need to be aware of these dynamics and understand, where sometimes things don't make sense, like this new evolution in Alberta that may not make that much sense. And in other cases, it may be something that seems super progressive, but it's actually not being enacted on the ground in a way that matches with that policy, like in the concrete way. And this is what I'm suggesting we take a look at projects that are being subjected to the new legislation now, to evaluate whether or not all these things that were supposed to be happening are actually happening. But again, the role of agency, an individual agency as part of civil society, is important. That is the message for tonight, is you as an individual and as a collective society have input, and that input has in the past changed environmental assessment and will in the future change environmental assessment. There we go. Right on the button. Any questions? That's a hopeful message. Well, I don't know. I don't want to be hopeful necessarily. I just practically speaking, like if you look at history, that's what history tells us. It's happened that way in the past. And yes, I'd like to be optimistic about stuff, but I'm very much a pragmatist because I deal with the practical side of reality, the bad and the good, all the time. But I do believe that it's irrefutable that society cannot change policy. It's been done before. We've seen it. And that's why we have the legislation that we have and the body of evolution that we have today. It's not like that one just happened one time. It's happened over time and influenced in different ways. Because there was some of that. Okay, I like the Mackenzie Valley assessment because there were so many thoughts about it to stop a complete destruction. Well, the Mackenzie Valley pipeline project is the best example, and I didn't go into it here because it's just too much there to go into. I could do a whole lecture. So Tom Berger was the man who was a lawyer and from British Columbia who led that inquiry in the 1970s, and he is actually a friend of my father's. And Tom Berger I'm sure he has the Order of Canada. If he doesn't, he definitely should have it. He is the one who I would say can be greatly responsible for a lot of the movement towards reconciliation with First Nations people. He was hired by Pierre Trudeau at the time, to go and do a consultation about the Mackenzie Valley pipeline. And the idea there was to not approve that. Like, the idea was to approve it, was to go and do a report. Like I'm saying, like, go do a report, and then you do your report, you come back, and then we'll approve the project. We'll push it forward, right? That was kind of like the subtext. But Berger went up there before he got hired. He went up and started meeting with people. Like, he wasn't even on the clock, and even with his wife in the northern part of Alberta and so forth, meeting with different community groups, going to barbecues. And he was hanging out with various different stakeholder groups, Indigenous groups, and so forth. And he got to know the people, and then he conducted the consultations. If you go on CBC, and or go on YouTube, and I'm going to find it right now because this is the classic example. Just one sec. I've got to find these videos. This is consultation on Berger. Oh, there we go. Beautiful. So this is one small bit. Here. This video here on YouTube is taken as part of the Tom Berger's Mackenzie Valley pipeline process, which was perhaps certainly the first and most comprehensive consultation with First Nations groups in Canada. This was extensive. He went to many communities. And if you watch this is on, when was this? 1975 is when they had this. This is from the Dene people, Chief Frank Tsele, where he gives his testimony, which is powerful. And he talks about like the fact that our blood will run before this pipeline is built. So this collective consultation that Tom Berger did resulted in that pipeline ultimately being canceled, because this was all on CBC. You know, this was like wide open. He blew it wide open, much to the chagrin of the federal government at the time. And so it took someone like that to actually do their job and really consult with people for, you know, for the stakeholders to have their say brought to the table. And that then opened the door to consultation with First Nations groups that were impacted. So there's the Dene, I think Métis as well. There's 3 groups, and Inuit, and that then opened the door to treaty negotiations. There's another great video of 10 years down the line, in the mid-'80s, of the same chief being interviewed by CBC, who is now supporting the pipeline project. So why do you think his tune changed? What happened? Communities needed jobs, yeah, but what else though? Like what was the big thing? Because the community needed jobs before. Interest changed even more so. It's not just that. The community needed jobs before. What would be the main difference with that project, particularly before and after that period of time? Rights. Being engaged and being included. So impact benefit agreements have now become part of the process in doing development projects. So once a group is empowered, if their territory is being impacted and they agree to that project based on the fact that they're being properly remunerated, there are jobs, there's education and training, the sharing of profit, whatever it is, whatever the deal is, that changes things dramatically. If you have no rights, then you probably will not be in favor of the project, because it's, you know, you're the one who's taking all the risks and impacted, yet you don't have any of the benefits. So this impact benefit agreements are the agreements that help to spell out how people will be impacted potentially, but also how they will benefit from that. So this is what I'm saying, like that consultation opened up the process of a more equitable playing field for dealing with First Nations in Canada, which, if you look at it from a broad perspective, really is a fundamental first step in moving towards a better and more equitable relationship between nation to nation, as they say, relationships. So when the context changes and the deals change and they're more equitable, perspectives can change. And things do change as well, right? Livelihoods change. Right now, for instance, living as a sustenance, living off of based a sustenance-based economy in the North is probably a lot more tough now than it was then in the 70s. Excuse me. Can't this create issues with the communities like Wet'suwet'en? Well, this is exactly it. I mean, this is the Wet'suwet'en is a very good example of this in action. The Wet'suwet'en and I'm not going to get into the details because I don't know enough about the details of that particular case, but from what I understand, the ancestral chiefs, some of the groups within the Wet'suwet'en were not properly consulted. Some were, some were not. There were some, obviously, that were half the deal. Others were not, and therefore the others that were not became vocal enough that caused that project to be halted and then negotiations to take place. But again, the idea of a properly and implemented impact benefit agreement is clearly very important to this process. If you don't have that, then you can have a variety of problems: social uprising, blockades, whatever. So identifying the different stakeholders is pretty key. It gets very complicated when you're dealing with certain First Nations groups because you have different dynamics within them. They're not like there's a variety of different structures within different First Nations groups within Canada and the world. My experience is more with groups outside of Canada at this point, but there's different structures. Ancestral chief versus elected chiefs, for instance. That's the big thing with the Wet'suwet'en. So we have to consider these things and we have to explore them. But again, this is something that is influenced by community response to these problems, and therefore policy will change. So like what happened with the Wet'suwet'en probably will cause people to do impact assessments differently and to ensure that all of the stakeholders that are relevant are properly compensated and properly consulted with, because that's the case that happened there. It appears that they weren't. All right, any other questions? Can we access the podcast even after the class? Yes. So what I have done is I have created, I will send it out. It's a form that you can fill in your name and email address. And so I don't want to send you updates, to your, if you're not in an active class, then I will not bother you. But I'll send out this form, and that will then put you on a distribution list that will then update you when we're going live and all that kind of stuff. So it's basically like the messages you get while you're in a course, but to your personal email, whatever email you want to use. So that will go out this week. I have that ready. I've already sent it out. So yes, you can. And I'm assuming it will get bigger because I have yet to forward that list to my previous classes, which I will, which probably like 10, 13, 15 different classes. So the party might get bigger. I assume the party will get bigger. We'll have more than 15 we're going to have, which is great because I like to connect with old students and stuff like that. And I will keep the content fresh. There's always stuff to talk about in this field. That's the thing. There's always something to talk about. Great. No, I like it. I think it's good. I mean, online learning can be tricky, when we're all in different circumstances, and especially right now with all the craziness going on in the world. And to be consistent every week, wherever you are with this, tied to your coursework and what you're doing for your career or what you're interested in, I think is it's good. It's healthy. Keeps us on track. At least we can have this consistency in this crazy world we're living in, right? It's like a regular soap opera, except maybe a bit less dramatic. Okay, so I will send out, that's to 322. You'll get that list, what you can sign up to, and the others as well, and 660 as well when you're finished. There we go. So anyway, I'm going to sign off. It's a bit later here. I'm out east. And hope you guys are healthy and safe. Stay safe. There's lots of COVID out there. And we'll talk to you soon.